Professor Ronald Davidson comes to us from Fairfield University, where he is the chair of the Religious Studies Department and also the director of the Humanities Centre. So welcome to Stanford, and
Thank you.
Looking forward to your talk. So.
Thank you. Well, I wish to thank the host Center for Buddhist Studies here at Stanford, Paul Harrison and John Kishnick, and Yiding for facilitating my invitation. My presentation today is a work in progress. What is not? So I must beg your indulgence. When this material is published in a book that has already taken far too long to write, I may change some observations, but I hope not too much. In particular, I hope to engage in a summary of some of my research, requiring me perhaps to gloss over some challenging issues. So we're going to think broad brush here today, guys. That's what we're going to do. All right. Okay. So it is hardly possible to study Buddhism or to observe Buddhists without bumping into mantras. These peculiar ritual phrases whose meanings seem to defy so many of our standards of linguistic significance. If you visit any Tibetan settlement or town, and you will doubtless see an enormous prayer wheel stuffed with mantras, or perhaps more properly, mantra Dharanese, that is, mantras extracted from a Dharanese scripture. The purpose of the Tibetan prayer flags is to bless the wind, so that the mantra Dharanese become a vehicle for the ideology of bodhisattva altruism. One performs acts for the benefit of others, known or not. Mantra Dharanese were sufficiently important that the earliest printing appears to have been invented by Buddhists for their propagation. As we know from the Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani, printed that survives in the Shakyamuni Temple at Bulguksa in Korea, somewhere between 689 and 751 of the Common Era, and the Rashmi Vimala Vishuddha Prabha Dharani, printed for the Million Pagodas by Emperor Shotoku, sometime around 770 of the Common Era. Even earlier, mantra Dharanese were inscribed in stone, as this later 969 CE example from Ling Tzu illustrates. And their being inscribed in stone must be related to the printing of Dharanese in terracotta stamps, as we see in the 7th to 8th century stamp from the British Museum. According to Ingo Stalk, the earliest surviving Buddhist manuscript is a Dharani for the protection against poison by the divine snake king Manasvi, a topic to which I will return. So now it is sometimes assumed that the encounter with Buddhist use of mantras arose during the period of European travel for colonialism. But this paints but a part of the picture. In this 1599 compendium of records from diplomats and merchants, we find stories of 4 Franciscan and Dominican priests who visited the encampment of the Great Khan in the mid-13th century. William of Rubruck, one of the French Franciscan friars, observed in his 1254 diplomatic record that on his visit to the Great Khan, he saw Uyghurs engaged in what is generally understood as mantra recitation. He noted that wherever they go, they have in their hands a string of 100 or 200 beads, like our rosaries, and they always repeat these words, Omani Bakam, which is, God, thou knowest, as one of them interpreted to me. And they expect as many rewards from God as they remember God in saying this. Now, the difficulties in understanding the meaning or meanings of mantras have plagued critical assessment ever since, which has tended either to dismiss them as, quote, consisting mostly of unmeaning gibberish, as L. Austin Waddell did in 1895, or to affirm them as transcendental and outside of linguistic analysis. Either case yields a null set of analytical results. It is instructive that William, in his 13th century inscription here, took neither direction and thus curiously represented a more scholarly response than some scholars have employed in the recent period. Our lack of understanding of mantras is exacerbated by a relative paucity of either traditional or modern literary, semantic, or pragmatic assessments, despite mantras' ubiquity. Most modern assessments, for example, become bogged down in issues of truth conditional or semantic meaning without examining if that is the best approach. Now, if we unpack good Friar William's statement for a moment, it evidently contains several somewhat interesting variables. One, there is a repetition of a set phrase, which is true, enumerated via a mala, or tengwa in Tibetan, commonly equated with the Roman Catholic rosary, as William does here, Paternoster. And three, directed to specific theological figure, so that the repetition, 4, is simultaneous with the recollection of the figure, and 5, all of these functions being based on an exchange model. The number of mantras equals the volume of expected benefits. I would like to explore some of these factors this evening and see what they tell us about Buddhist employment of mantras. It is not clear from the available documents how all of these elements become associated. So if you will bear with me, we can do a little bit of exploration of mantra's backstory, to employ the jargon of journalism. Now, as well known, the word mantra has its origin in the designation identifying Vedic verses. And the Vedic corpus is sometimes broken down into the pair mantra brahmana, meaning mantra meaning the Samhita liturgical verses, and brahmana meaning their ritual directions as found within the several brahmana, aranyaka, and sutra texts that accompany the Veda Samhitas. The theological position propagated by the Mimamsa school of Vedic philosophy is that mantras of Shruti, the Vedic texts, are aparusheya, that is, meaning they are outside of human origin. And this has lent an aura of permanence to Vedic mantras, as if the Vedic tradition never changed anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. Long after the initial Veda Samhitas were codified, new mantras continued to be fashioned. And some of these were included in later recensions of the Vedas, or were brought together into collections, as in the mantra Brahmana, the mantra Pata, or the mantra Samhita, respectively, of the Kautuma, Apastamba, and Vaikanasa branches of Vedic lore, demonstrating the effervescence of both the Samaveda and the Ajurveda traditions in ancient and medieval India. The Atharva Veda and Rig Veda traditions also continued to formulate new mantras, as visible in the cases of the Paipalada and Ashvalayana and Akila texts and the other documents. But I have not seen a notice of a self-contained mantra collection with these branches of Vedic practice. Even more, if we look at the ritual texts associated with the smarta practices of the Vedic traditions in Shunga and Gupta India, we see that they provide explicit directions on how to construct or to modify mantras. This is necessary in the instance of the grihya, or domestic rituals. And I believe that many texts associated with the domestic rituals have not been accorded sufficient scholarly attention because of their lesser status, even though they arguably defined much of Indian religion as it was practiced day in and day out. The reason Smarta Brahmins produced or modified mantras was simple. As the texts affirm, if there are local traditions, these should be respected and integrated into the Vedic tradition, especially in the case of marriage, but not limited to that. So, for example, how do you deal with family divinities of the bride and the groom? According to the Hiranyagesha Kriya Sutra and the Shrauta Sutra, all mantras were to have svaha at the end. And if there is a divinity without a mantra, then take its name, fix svaha at the end, and bingo, you have a mantra. Similar strategies were employed in the domestic ritual literature of most other Vedic traditions. Just as astonishing is the modification of a mantra, as in the case of the invocation that kusha grass should protect a person during a head shaving. So the example given is the common Vedic mantra, Oshade Trayasva Enam, plant protect him, which becomes transformed by this rule into Oshade Trayasva Mam, plant protect me. So in the case of an infant, as we have here, when his head is shaved, the protective kusha grass being held in the hand of the barber, and the mantra is said by the father. But in the case of a Vedic student, he is to say it for himself. Other instances are provided in the literature, but it is interesting that this meta rule about mantra change is not given in some exalted treatise on mantras, but in the midst of a long list of otherwise unexceptionable rules for boys studying the Vedas. Other texts require the transformation of designation and mantras during the ritual of Shraddha, which are done in the rites of offering and to the ancestors. Consequently, when we understand that the modification of existing mantras and the creation of new ones is not unusual, but the norm for Brahmins engaged in daily ritual enterprises in ancient India. And this brings us back to Friar William's observation, that he understood mantras to be recited many times. I must admit to being a bit obsessed about this issue recently as I plunged more and more into Vedic texts. The problem is simple. If mantras are spells affecting the success of the ritual, as they are understood, then why would you need to repeat them? Invocations are usually said once, sometimes 3 times, 3rd time's a charm, or some other modest amount. For example, in the opening ceremony for Vedic study, the Veda in question is sometimes said to be recited verse by verse, but it is not repeatedly recited. So we see in the Shankayana Grihya Sutra here, let the teacher make offerings of barley and grains mixed with curds and ghee, then recite the whole Rig Veda 1 verse at a time, pratirich, according to some. Or by the first verses of the Suktas and the Anavakas. But Kaushitaki says, I laud Agni, the minister, the priest, the deity of the sacrifice. Just this one verse, and that's the first verse of the Rig Veda. So you start your instruction simply by reciting the first verse of the Rig Veda. Thus, the lengthy numbers given in Buddhist or other tantric texts for the repetition of mantras cannot be used in the kind of daily ritual systems found in the Vedic corpus, or even in many Buddhist rituals. I've not seen that any of the usual authorities have even noticed the problem, but it is easy to see that there's a substantial pragmatic difference between using a phrase once or thrice and as a piece of liturgy, and then again reciting it 100,000 times. The distinction is to some degree encoded in the verbs used to describe the saying of mantras. In ritual texts, mantras are mostly given various routes of speaking. So I've combed through the liturgy and I can't. My little red dot doesn't show up on the screen here. So I combed through the literature, and all of these are the verbs used for saying of the mantras within Vedic literature, right? So mostly are various routes of speaking, vach, bru, etc. Often there is no marker at all. There's just the mantra, and then at the end of it there is the grammatical marker iti, just roughly equivalent to quotation marks. Occasionally they are denoted by how they are sung, using the verb gai, to sing. Whereas other verbs in this list denote saying or repeating after a person, the verb japati, our last verb down there, may be used for either multiple repetition or one-time recitation. Moreover, Vedic traditions often require a specific pitch or accent to be employed, with Vedic texts indicating a high, udata, a low pitch, anudata, and the falling accent, swarita, although Samaveda texts have much more elaborate tonal designations. Even then, it is disturbing to note that the accents given in the manuscripts and the printed editions seldom accord with contemporary practice. And even the meaning of tonal terminology was changed from time to time. We may also note that there were 3 sound volume levels in Vedic recitation. Forte, uchai. I went too fast? Yes, right. So there were forte, uchai, piano, upamshu, and sotavoce, vakyata, or japata. In distinction to the Vedic accent, the volume level appears reasonably often in the classical texts, and the word japati is the operative verb for much of mantra recitation in Buddhist texts. That is to be said almost inaudibly, but is less frequently mentioned in the Dhanani literature. To make a long story short, it appears that the use of repetition for a mantra, sotto voce, really began with the schoolboys again. At several times during their initiation and instruction, they were expected to recite for some duration the Gayatri, the initiatory mantra given during the Upanayana initiation ceremony. And this is the Gayatri. Om bhu bhurva bhuva saha tat savitur varenyam bhargo devasya dhimahi dhiyo naha prachodayat. So, Om bhu bhuva saha we reflect on the highest radiance of the divine Savitr, the solar deity. May he inspire our intelligence. They continually repeat immediately after being initiated or during the morning and evening twilight ceremonies, generally with the syllable Om and the Vyakrtis, these Bu, Bhuva, Swa, put into the front, prefaced in the front. It is the Gayatri repetition that is emphasized and indeed foregrounded in an interesting section of the Mahabharata that discusses the spiritual benefits of recitation as well as its pitfalls. The discourse begins with an interesting figure, Kaushika Paipaladi, a descendant of Kaushika and of the Paipalada Gotra associated with the Paipalada recension of the Atharva Veda. Based on his recitation of the Gayatri, heaven appears and pronounces him and his companion Ikshvaku to be siddhas, perfected, and Brahma awards them the highest benefit by having them directly enter into his body. The section concludes by assuring the listener that mantra reciters enjoy the same benefits as yogins, but reciters are actually superior as they have greater concentration. Now, having touched on the Vedic background, we may wish to shift gears and point out that Vedic sourcing alone is insufficient to explain Buddhist mantras, although it is clearly contributory. The relationship of the elite systems to marginal culture, including Buddhist marginal culture, the explanations to date are not entirely satisfactory. The late Fritz Stahl, for example, opined that bija mantras, these seed syllables used in Buddhist tantras, and non-lexical, or in his vocabulary, meaningless terms, came from the Hinkara of the Rig Veda. That is, in the Rig Veda, sometimes you're supposed to use the term hing or hing in certain ritual events, or the stobhas of the Samaveda. Now, stobhas are interesting non-lexical verse completers. And you have these O, Ho, Va, Ha, Va, 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 or say Da 34 times. Go ahead and do it. That's fine. You take the lead here. These stobhas are non-lexical verse completers, often repeated over and over again to provide sounds that may carry the tunes expressed in the Samaveda, tunes said to have been drawn from either village or forest environments. We have two big Samaveda compendia. One is the Aranyagana, the songs of the forest, and the other one is the Gramagana, the songs of the village. Now, doubtless the Samaveda systems did provide some impetus, but while the claims are intriguing, they are not without difficulty. The earliest Buddhist bija mantras, that is the one-syllable ekakshara mantra, generally employ complex consonant conjuncts, sometimes to the point of impronounceability. If you try and pronounce this clean air, the last of the four, broom, bling, bling, clean, I haven't an idea how that's supposed to all be put together. And it gets worse. It doesn't get better over time. These bija mantras are often stacked up multiple consonants without any vowels. It's like Welsh. It's just, where are all these consonants coming from, right? Okay. Similarly, while the stobhas may have provided the idea and some features of non-lexical sounds in some mantras, the characteristic Samaveda stobhas include the repetition over and over again of the term hova. And the completion of the line often has a term om replacing the final syllable, so that if satyam ends at the end of a line in the Samaveda, it's pronounced satyom. If narayanam is at the end of a line, it's pronounced narayanom. I have seen this in early sectarian texts, the Vishnu Dharma and the Shiva Dharma, but not in Buddhist usage. Buddhist mantras also tend to use syllables different to a great degree from the stobha collections, especially in their use of retroflex sounds. We see many, these kinds of retroflex sounds you just don't see in the stobhas. So, perhaps more important, none of the Samaveda versifications, and I've got it down there, all of the kinds of versifications in which there are seven different tone signatures for Samaveda chants, none of these versifications or tune signatures are evident in Buddhist usage, and these define the Samaveda chants. If in response to the linguistic and pragmatic distinctions between Buddhist mantras and their Vedic predecessors, we choose to look for other sources of mantras, one of the best attested is the act of truth. and the early Buddhist mantras sometimes reference themselves as acts of truth, as pointed out by Skilling. Typically, acts or statements of truth involve two back-to-back statements. First, there is an assertive, using Searle's speech act typology, that is an assertion of a specific truth. Second, this is followed by a directive, an imperative statement that some goal should thereby, the act of truth, should affect that goal. So in the Supbaraka Jataka, the Bodhisattva is a blind mariner, yet, as always, supernormally accomplished. So his ship strays into the greatest of all dangers, the Valabhamuka, the sea monster's mouth. But by means of his act of truth, he could save the day. Is assertive ever since I first recalled myself or attained cognizance, I'm not aware of harming intentionally a single being. The truth of that, by the truth of this statement, may the boat return safely. Now, in his explanation of this statement of truth ideas, which is very, very old in Indo-European mythology, the monk Nagasena in the Milinda Panha shares his understanding that truth operates in a performative manner, and stating the truth provides the force for the alteration of the nature of the world. The directive then focuses that force for the ends of the person speaking the expression of truth. At least that's the theory. But not all acts of truth follow the assertive directive format, and this seems to have been overlooked by those seeking the overarching formula. In some interesting instances, we simply find the imperative directive alone, without any assertive truth, as in the first three instances in the questions of Melinda. Some siddhas, Your Majesty, sing truth, make the great cloud rain, and by the singing of that truth, the great cloud rains. And there are some siddhas who sing truth, may the great shining and blazing mass of fire turn back. And by the singing of that truth, the great shining and blazing mass of fire turn back. Or, Your Majesty, there are some siddhas who sing truth. May this halahala poison become medicine. And by the power of that singing of truth, the halahala poison instantaneously became medicine. These are very interesting for a variety of reasons, and I will only name three. They concern issues that are perennial Buddhist issues: turning back fire, turning back poison, and causing rainfall. 2, so far as I've been able to detect, these are the only acts of truth in the Pali materials to feature figures called siddhas. And 3, to my earlier point, they are apparently framed exclusively in the imperative, as if this were the act of truth, much as we find when Buddhist mantras include an imperative verb. In the Pali instances, the imperative seems to have no subject, and it is difficult to see to whom is it addressed. But some Sanskritic examples make this unremarkable. So, homage to the Tathagata, whose sound is that of the rumbling ocean of Dharma. Rumble, rumble, he rumbles, swaha. And I love this one because I love this verb, garja, garja. Garja, garja, garja te, swaha. There are wonderful Sanskrit verbs for onomatopoeia. Though in some of the mantras, this is immediately found by Guda Gudayate, and this is the rumbling that is supposed to be in the belly of the thunder, right? And the same as your rumblings is Guda Gudayate, right? Okay. Or a slice I took out of the Mahashitavati Dharani, and the Lord Buddha, Lord King of the Dharma, highest sympathizer for the world, protect me and all beings. Now, at the risk of undercutting my own argument, it is sometimes not even clear within mantras that the imperative might not actually be some other form of speech. However, in many instances, and in this case of these two, I believe it is safe to assume the imperative. There is a problem with Buddhist mantras in that regard. The other uncertainty is the first part of the directive, by virtue of this truth, which is only intermittently associated with Buddhist mantras. Still, we regularly find Buddhist mantras framed in the matter of the directive force as if their declaration alone were sufficient without a specific truth assertive, much as our siddhas have done. Be that as it may, the aggregate evidence allows us to propose there are at least two contributors to the form of Buddhist mantras. First, are Vedic ritualists, known as Smarta Brahmins, not because they were smarter, but because they had adhered to the texts of Smriti, the great mass of ritual, legal, and narrative material that makes up much of India. Second were the rather underground groups of siddhas, faith healers, exorcists, seers, witches, and magicians who pop in and out of Buddhist literature. Yet, These groups were around long before Buddhists used mantras. So we may frame the problem thus. Were there other causes for Buddhists to articulate a narrative in which the Buddha is said to have revealed mantras for the protection or healing of the two most common early uses of mantras? The problem is that our texts tend to flatten out the circumstances by adhering to rather thin causal descriptions. So when Paul Harrison worked on the Dhamma Kinnara, it indicates that its mantra is to ward off threats to the Dharma or believers in the Sangha by yakshas, rakshasas, gandharvas, kinnaras, mahoragas, kumbandhas, humans and non-humans, and all those who harbor animosity to the Buddha Shasana. But this doesn't tell us very much. Other than there is a vast right-wing conspiracy against the Buddha Dharma, probably funded by the Koch brothers or whoever it was their equivalent in first century India. But even such indications would suggest that other actors, cult sites supported by the social agents of the gods, the yakshas, etc., we may also understand social valorization of spirit possession by those theological personae with attendant healing or exorcistic functions. In some, it is impossible to ignore the voices of sectarian or site-specific cults in the beginning of the Common Era, and this is when they all come due, when our first Buddhist mantras occur. The difference between the Vedic mantras and the epic or Puranic sectarian mantras are sometimes rather stark, particularly in vocabulary. In the Vishnu Dharma, an early Vaishnava text from the Gupta era, we see the mantra, Om, homage to the highest person, the great self, to him with many forms and formlessness, the pervader, the ultimate self. When we look at the new mantras of the Sanskritic deities, we frequently find analogous panegyric examples, or alternatively, these with some modification of the Vedic parameters, as in its early non-Vedic mantra, Om Bhu Purusham Avahyami, Om Bhuva Purusham Avahyami, Om Suva Purusham Avahyami. So what you have Om, and then one of the Vyakharatis, then Purusham Avahyami, for a Rudra Pratishthakalpa and the Bodhayana Guru Parishesha. And this is a non-Vedic mantra being used for non-Vedic purposes, that is, the establishment of an image of Rudra. Missing in action here, as elsewhere, are the sacred phrases, whatever they may have been, of the various yaksha, naga, pishastra, and other sorts of terms, local spirit cults. Right? So we have our Buddhist pragmatic markers, tadyata and swaha, as pragmatic markers in many, perhaps most Buddhist mantras, are generally seldom found within these early kind of circumstances. You have Om here, which actually is not found within the earliest Buddhist mantras. You almost never find Om before the 7th century. And I've combed the literature looking for it. All right. Instead, you have tadyata all the time. So what we don't have are these other sorts of things. Yet our early mantra, the Nagaraja, Manasvi, and Gandhari, may provide some direction. As shown by Strauch, this mantra looks to be constituted by a series of poisons that are reproduced elsewhere, so that the mantra identifies the defining layability under the control of Manasvi, who apparently is called on by naming his poisons. Now, absent in this mantra, and found later versions within the Mahamayuri and elsewhere, are the Buddhist mantra pragmatic markers, Namo, Tadyata, and Swaha at the end. Thus, once the poison mantra was normalized in Buddhist use, it features the combination of one or two Vedic pragmatic markers, Om and Swaha, with one non-Vedic pragmatic marker, Tadyata, that is to say, combined with specifically non-Vedic content, as we see in the example from the Ekadasha Mukha Hridaya of the 6th century. So we have this formula for early Buddhist mantras, Om, Namo, say your name here, Anam, Abhya, Aya, and then we have a Tadyata, and then we have this Buddhist, or some content taken from somewhere in the Manasvi, it becomes the poisons, right? And these are examples. We say, oh, Namo Ratnatrayaya, so homage to the three jewels, Arya Avalokiteshvaraya, Bodhisattvaya, Mahasattva, Mahakarunaya, Tadyata, and then we have this stuff that is very difficult to understand how it is. It's Masi, Disi, Chari, Huru, Ichuru, Suru, Swaha. So the Swaha is Vedic, but everything come between Aya and the Swaha, or Tadyata and the Swaha, is a little more difficult to understand. Alas, even this combination of various cultic sources leaves us but slightly closer to understanding how these were received, recombined, and institutionalized by Buddhists. Lucky for us, there are other possibilities, and one of the most fruitful is the examination of the various Vinaya texts, especially the ones rendered into Chinese. There we find various interesting episodes that depict the surreptitious importation of mantra practices by those becoming Buddhist monks and nuns, but simultaneously bringing along with them their pre-Buddhist religious life. The example of Kala, a nun, is found in the Sarvastivada Bhikshuni Vinaya Vibhanga, and it's illustrative of the process. So we start with the Sravasti Nidana. Then there was a Bhikshuni named Kala, who had earlier been a follower of the non-Buddhist path, and then abandoned the sutras, the Vinaya, and the Abhidharma, and taught her lay disciples to recite the various kinds of mantras. Within the Bhikshuni Sangha, however, there was one Bhikshuni of few desires, who was intelligent, a practitioner of the Dutta-guna ascetic practices. She heard of this business and was unhappy. For various reasons, she criticized the errant Bhikshuni, saying, "How is this possible, Bhikshuni? How have you abandoned the sutras, the Vinaya, and the Abhidharma, and taught the various kinds of mantras to the laity?" Now, having criticized this Bhikshuni for various reasons, she spoke at length to the Buddha. The Buddha called together the two sections of the Bhikshuni and Bhikshu Sangha to find out, and asked, "Kala Bhikshuni, is it true that you has been said of you or not?" She replied, "Yes, I did, Lord." The Buddha reprimanded her, saying, "How is this possible, Bhikshuni, that you have abandoned the sutras, the Vinaya, the Abhidharma, but taught lay disciples to recite various kinds of mantras?" Having reprimanded her for various reasons, he spoke to the assembly. "For 10 wholesome purposes you bind up the Bhikshuni Shiksha. From henceforth, this rule should be declared. If any Bhikshuni who teaches the laity to recite various mantras, that is apatayantika." And before everybody starts on me, that's a specific Sarvastivada usage. Which consumes virtue. If it has not been confessed, it is able to be an obstacle to the path. As this is a madhyapati, another Sarvastivada Vinaya idiolect, the following faults occur. If a Bhikshuni teaches the laity various kinds of mantras, if she teaches verse by verse, for each verse there is a patayantika. If she teaches sentence by sentence, for each sentence there is a patayantika. If she teaches word by word, for each word there is a patayantika. This is tough, man. This is really strict, right? Okay. There is, however, and this is the operative point here, there is no fault, however, in teaching mantras for control of dental problems, stomach pains, or venomous bite. Since these are for the purpose of protection, there is no fault. Now we see that the problem here is not one of the use of mantras per se. This is one of the 3 episodes in the Vinaya for Kala, and elsewhere the Vinaya text indicates that Kala's recitation of mantras sometimes precipitated quarreling with other Bhikshunis. But the issue here is the teaching of non-Buddhist mantras to the laity, who are surreptitiously being dissuaded thereby from pursuing the Buddhist path, as Kala apparently did not herself wish to pursue it. Now, lest we surmise that this is an example of those awful bhikshus blaming the bhikshunis alone for introduction of mantras, there are many examples of bhikshus being reprimanded. So let us turn to and look at one attributed to those lovable monastic keystone cops, the clown princes of the Vinaya, the group of 6 bhikshus. In the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, these also took to mantras. There was the group of 6 bhikshus recited Tirthika mantras employed in amulets concerned with good and bad fortune and within homes, and Sandhya mantras, that is for twilight mantras, and Kshatriya mantras, and Shabara mantras, and mantras for foretelling birth, death, and fortune of men, mantras releasing all sounds. A monk asked the Buddha, and he replied, "It is not allowed." They taught the mantras. Buddha said, "It is not allowed." They used them to obtain livelihood. The Buddha said, "It is not allowed." Stop it. So far, what we have seen is that mantras were desired by those within the Buddhist community who still strongly identified with their previous religious practices. But mantras were at the same time allowable under certain circumstances, but not others. Now, one of the more important conditions was that mantras should not be used for a vehicle for the introduction of forbidden conduct. So we find a decision in the Sarvastivada Vinaya that if two monks use mantras to transform themselves into animals and then have sex, it is still a parajika defeat. And likewise, if a monk or a nun raises a vitala from the dead and has it threaten or kill another person, it is either a serious fault or a defeat. The overwhelming number of concerns, however, is about incorrect livelihood. And monks seem to be using mantras as a revenue stream, as our deans now all say. Consequently, early European assessments that the use of mantras violated the rule for Shila Vrata Paramarsha, that is, addiction to ritual, was really off the mark. And Etienne Lamont said this, and he was not right. In the case of mantras, the Vinayas are concerned with mithya jiva overall, incorrect livelihood, as in a lengthy list in the Mulasavastavada Vinaya Sanghabheda Vastu that explains a very long list and then alludes to an earlier list of mithya jiva that stretches all the way back to the Brahmajala Sutra and the Agamas and the Nikayas. Now, in the midst of this, however, we can see that mantras have been quasi-legitimized. They are acceptable if they are employed for protection or healing, or if the recitation of a mantra is taken as part of the Buddhist path. The latter is seen in the case of one monk who wanted to recite Namo Bhagawan as his mantra, doubtless derived from a Narayana practice. In his case, this was acceptable if the correct attitude was maintained. However, we do not have the use of mantras for offering, confession, beyond simple homage, or any of the other 7 practices of the Bodhisattva which are part of the standard Buddhist repertoire by the end of the Gupta. The expansion of mantras, by now called mantradananīs, into these more public rituals doubtless happened with the agency of arguably the most important social group in Gupta Mahayana Buddhism. I am speaking of Dharmabhanikas, the Mahayanist preachers. Mahayanist literature consistently represented these figures as closely associated with mantradananīs. And their use of mantradananīs was directly in relationship to lay audience, as this statement in the Karuna Pundarika suggests. And whatever bodhisattva, even though he doesn't meditate, cultivate, or recite the Sarvajñata Karadharani, if he binds on a crown onto a Dharmabhanika while listening to the Dharani, then as many Lord Buddhas as are equal to grains of sand of the river Ganges and residing in the other world systems will stay and remain firm and supportive and will praise him with a sadhu, well done. And those very Lord Buddhas will give him a prophecy for his final highest awakening. The involvement of the Dharmabhanikas with mantras and ultimately with other rituals like homa and mandalas was facilitated by 3 primary factors. One is the circumstance alluded to, the cultivation of a clientele, so that personalities like Vishuddha Charita and the Sarvadharma Apravarti Nadesha, or Supushpa Chandra and the Smadhi Raja, were featured as paragons of how the Dharmabhanika was to interact with the laity, including the use of mantradananīs as a medium for their involvement. Second, they did so because mantras, whether Vedic or otherwise, were most often considered fundamental currency of offering systems. As in the Pratima Nataka, drama attributed to the playwright Bhasa, has his protagonist Bharata note when coming on the images of his own ancestors, which he doesn't recognize, in the ancestral hall in Ayodhya. He comes and he sees them, and he's curious, but he says, if these are gods, he sees his ancestors, he doesn't recognize them. If these are gods, then it is desirable and proper to bow my head down. But only a Shudra would pay homage to a god worshipped without mantras. The Vayu Purana has a similar prohibition concerning the celebration of ancestral rites. They may even be done by Shudras. I mean, Shudras have ancestors too. They may even be done by Shudras, but without pronouncing the appropriate mantras. In the Manavagrihya Sutra as well, even a Shudra, when the ritual of warding off snakes in the Shravana, the Sarpabali, may be performed even by a Shudra woman, so long as she doesn't speak the mantras and washes her hands. In the face of such social categorization, the Buddhist Dharmabhanikas would either have employed some variety of mantras or have found themselves categorized and identified with low caste worship systems, an intolerable position in the Gupta period as it became increasingly ritualized along Brahminical lines. Finally, yet another motivation for the Dharmabhanikas to employ mantras was the simple fact that some of them were laymen. Now, of course, it's been a long time since we had the idea that Mahayana was a lay product, and this is no longer accepted. That's great. I agree. But nonetheless, we find attested in Gupta period at least 2 laymen seemingly were acting as preachers esteemed by monks. As Fasyan tells us, there was one Mahayana Brahmanaputra named Revataswami living within the city of Pataliputra. He was intelligent, learned, and there was no topic he could not penetrate. He lived purely celibate by himself. The king honored and revered him as his teacher. If the king came to inquire about some matter, he would not dare to sit before the teacher. The king would display his dedication with an attitude of love and respect and grasp the teacher's hand. The king's touch finished, the Brahmana teacher would immediately bathe himself to cleanse from the residue of the king's touch. A very Brahminical activity here. The teacher was 50-something years old. The entire nation looked up to him with reverence. Based on just this one man, there was an expansion of the Buddha Dharma. The Tirthikas were not able to spread insults about the Sangha. By the Ashoka Chaitya, the king built a Mahayana Sangharama Suchitra, and there was also a Hinayana monastery. Altogether, maybe 600 to 700 monks could be seen maintaining dignity and educating students. Monks of the Sangha of the 4 directions with elevated virtue could come and question people there. If they wished to search the meaning of some passage, they would go to that monastery. There was a Brahmanaputra, an acharya there named Manjushri. All the Shramanas with great virtues in the kingdom and the Mahayana bhikshus revered and respected him, and he resided in the Sangharama. Now, of course, we could also invoke the better attested literary figures of Vimalakirti and Srimala Devi, but it is nice to find records of actual human beings. Lest we doubt that this was the case, the Sarvatathagata Svadhisthana informs us that during the waxing phase of the moon, having become pure with his body well washed, observing the 8 precepts of Upavasa, he arrives at the 8th in a pure place, blessed by the Buddha, setting out incense, flowers, banners, and flags, full vases of water. That place and the Dharmabhanika are to be cleansed and wearing white. Because white is the designation of the layman within India. Now, once a few laymen were recognized as Dharmabhanikas, their specific influence as intermediaries to the larger populace, as seen in Fasyan's record, was undoubtedly had a larger footprint than their overall numbers. They also brought with them their own lay concerns. Much as the laicization of the Nepalese Vajracharyas in the late medieval period, the laicization of the Japanese Sangha in 1872 with the proclamation of Nukajiki Saitai, Decriminalization Act, in these instances, the rituals and values of the surrounding lay communities quickly became part of temple practice. And we see some of the same thing happening in Gupta India. And the mantra recitation, its employment in rituals and use in a variety of circumstances was part of that transition. So what did we learn, Dorothy? The Vedic tradition needed to produce continually new mantras yielding a specific pattern for their production. Mantras came to be employed in the practice of repetition of the Gayatri, apparently not counted, but time-based. Mantras, or mantra-like phrases, were employed by both the sectarian and village magical groups for different reasons. Buddhists initially saw mantras as a problem, to be allowed in very limited venues, primarily protection and healing, but also paying homage to the Buddha. Mahayana preachers further facilitated the development of mantra dhananis in their involvement with lay supporters. The lay population understood that ritual systems required mantras, for only low castes did rituals without mantras. Some Dharmabhanikas were recognized among the laity, so that in the Gupta period, the office of the lay preacher became an acceptable, if not an ideal, position. Lay Dharmabhanikas became concerned with a larger menu of rituals. The Grihya domestic rites incumbent on the twice-born Indians. Even while they were Buddhists, they were also member of caste communities, which themselves continued to evolve. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience. Saha. And when we're talking about these lay Dharmabhanikas, I mean, the thing I think we need to keep in mind is that the Buddhist monastery has this image of this permanent institution, but it's always been a revolving door. And that's a simple fact. At any one time in the history of Buddhism, you're going to find laymen who had been monks living within the community. They may have been very well trained. Frequently, an elder brother will die, and then they need to take the family position, something of that nature. Sometimes you'll find laymen living within the monastery, acting in the manner of monks, but not receiving ordination. They may have bought or built a small hovel for themselves, a house for themselves, supported the monastery in other ways, moved on in there, and acted within their capacity. As time goes on, these self-funded individuals are going to be increasingly well-educated. And so because of that, we see this, every Buddhist monastery I've ever been around usually has this kind of circle of really well-educated lay supporters immediately in the environment. Some of them had been monks, some of them lived in the monastery, some of them were really well authenticated. What's different is by the Gupta period, some of these guys are given authority and authenticity, and that's what's going to happen. It's never going to be more than the monks within the monastery, right? When we look at the number of bodhisattvas within the Vimalakirti, for example, we have 6 bodhisattvas who are supposed to come and visit Vimalakirti, right? Other than Mishra, right? 5 of those guys are monks, but one, Sudatta, is a layman. And he's always represented as a layman, right? He, in the process of doing an Atiratra yajna, for example, that's how it's described there. Right? So he's involved in Brahminical enterprise, right? At the same time of being a Buddhist partisan. And so it's guys like that that are of interest to me. And it's guys like that, ultimately, that will assist opening the door to the Brahminical ritual enterprises.
Can I ask you about the formal markers, Tadyata and Svaha?
Yeah.
What's our earliest evidence for Tadyata? If not the Drumakinaraja. I don't know. I think it might be there.
It is there.
Yeah.
It is there. It's in your mantra there in the Drumakinaraja, right?
Is it in the Ingo Strauch's text?
No, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. But it makes it into the Mahamayuri, right? So, you know, it's really hard to say, but you find it within all of the earliest mantra texts, right? So the Mahamegha Sutra, this other big snake text, it's within the Mahamayuri, it's within every early Mahayana text that's going to discuss Dhananis. And so, you know, this text from Bajor that Strauch worked on is really out there. I mean, it's really peculiar because it doesn't have any of the pragmatic markers associated with Buddhism at all in it. It's just these poisons, and that's called the mantra, right? And it's called that twice within the text, so it's like there's no question that that's what's going on. Right? So I can't really answer your question, but it becomes a normative pragmatic marker within Buddhism. And in that article I published about, 18, 20 months ago in Bulletin School of Oriental African Studies, I go through the evolution of Tadyata as a pragmatic marker, and we really see it first occur in the Aitareya Brahmana. So it's a Rig Veda Brahmana system. And it's right in the Brahmana. It's such an interesting text, that Brahmana. But you can see it evolve in the history of the text. And towards the latter parts of the text, then you have Tajita operating it. And it goes all through, you find it's all through Vakataka inscriptions, all through Vakataka inscriptions. So it's not any question that it's an operative term at that time. John?
I guess prayer beads don't make sense unless you're repeating them.
Right.
Right? So can you shed any light on the origins of prayer beads, of when they appeared or where they came from?
I sure wish I could. I mean, all of a sudden Rudrakshas show up, right? And I don't recall much about Mala per se earlier than this one text that I've translated. I'll be publishing. This is Taisho 1007. This is this Muli Mantra that mentions it. Mentions a mala, a rosary. There's a mantra for it, but I don't recall having seen anything earlier than that. I mean, when we look at, the Mahamayuri has got always in the Chinese translation. There's a little appendix there at the end of the Mahamayuri, and it's usually our vidli, how to celebrate the Mahamayuri, and it only deals with setting up an altar. That's all it deals with, right? And it's a very normative Grihya Sutra altar. It's called Standila. It's not even called a mandala. It's a Standila in the Grihya Sutras. And we see that within Sanskrit texts, Buddhist texts, as a matter of fact. But that altar it doesn't discuss this issue of repetition and counting in the way that you find it within the Muli Mantra. And that's the reason why this Muli Mantra is so important, because all of a sudden, in somewhere around 475, it's supposed to be translated in the early Yang, so 503, 557, that's ostensibly the window of translation, but that's only identified by Zhesheng, so it's a little soft, but it looks good generally, because it looks like the other stuff that's attributed that. It's supposed to go back to an identification in a Liangshu, so not really sure, but okay. But if it comes from the early Liang, that Liang period, then it's pretty clear that it's a late 5th century text, something of that nature, and all of a sudden it really ups the Buddhist ritual game. And all of a sudden you have all of these things, and mudras, and you have mantras, and you've got visualization of yourself as Vajrapani, and you've got a painting text, and you've got all this kind of stuff that all of a sudden comes on in there. And I've spent the last several years tracing down its sources. 25% of the text is absolutely unique to that text. The text is translated, ostensibly translated 3 times into Chinese, once into Tibetan, and we have Gilgit fragments. But 25% of that early text, and the early text is the longest of them all in terms of the ritual sections, the longest of them all. And it's got some stuff that really is drawn from an Atharva Veda tradition. The rest of the ritual stuff is not Atharva Veda, it's Yajur Veda or Sama Veda. It's really, you have this difference in Vedic schools right within the text, right? It's very interesting for that reason. And so I've been trying to ferret out exactly where this stuff is coming from. And I'm pretty much done with that. Right? Yes?
I have a question about the contemporary Tibetan mantras.
Yes.
Are they an evolution, or are they just, they spring like new mantras?
It's like almost everything in Buddhism, you have to say the answer is yes. The answer to your question is yes. Most mantras that Buddhists recite are going to go back to India, but that's not true of all, and that's particularly true in 2 venues. There were mantras that were developed in Tibet within the Mahamudra tradition among the Kagyupas, and that starts out in the 11th century, and I've been able to identify. I mean, one of the mantras that's developed in the Shiche tradition there has a Tibetan place name embedded in it. So it's a little soft there, right? But some of the mantras, particularly for the Nyingmapa Terma tradition, the treasure tradition, are just in Tibetan. That's what they are, particularly from the 18th century on. They're just written in Tibetan, right? So they're a little bit like our other pragmatic markers. They'll have an Om and maybe a Tajita, and then a big line of Tibetan and a Swaha at the end, It's like, any port in a storm, right? So in the royal dynastic period, that is in the late 8th and early 9th period, there was for a while occasional text that would translate the mantras. And the Manjushri Namasankirti, the earliest translation, did that. And that's one of the things that piqued my curiosity about it, because that was the first text I really worked on. And that text, the earliest recension, that was a royal dynastic recension, it was said to have been done later, but it wasn't. That translated the mantras. And later on, they didn't translate the mantras. They rendered them into Tibetan script, but they were Sanskritic. So Buddhists have had sort of this weird dance with reference to mantras. Should you understand them? Should you not understand them? Should, you know, is it just sound or is it not sound? If it's only sound, then how do they get changed all the time? You know, this is the 100-syllable mantra of, Vajrasattva. If you get a Tibetan pronounce that, or if you get a Japanese to pronounce that, and they both say it, right, you can't recognize it as the same mantra, and it certainly is pretty far away from Sanskrit. Yeah?
Yeah, I sort of want to go off of what you just said there in terms of the relation to sound. Usually I think of mantras as something vocalized, or something involving sound.
Yeah.
You mentioned, sort of the sutra performance of silent mantras.
No, they wouldn't perform mantras. They weren't supposed to perform mantras. They actually did. You know, one of our early Buddhist texts, the Matangi Sutra, there's this witch, the tribal witch, a Matangi, and she recites a mantra while investing his spirit into with love potion so that Ananda will fall in love with her daughter, right? And it supposedly works, and then there has to be some Buddha mantra uttered in response to that that releases Ananda from this spell, right? This love potion spell, right? So it's pretty clear that whatever, the Brahminical ideology of, the Shudras don't have mantras, we have mantras because we're the good guys. We're twice born and they're not, right? The reality is that the Gurukha Sutras are said in public venues in India. When you would perform a homa ceremony, you would take your upasana fire, your home fire, and then you walk in the northeast direction, usually 100 yards or something like that. When you're doing the Sarpa Bali, for example, or you're doing some of these other ceremonies, you walk in the northeast direction, and you build up a standila, and you bring the fire with you, and you put it on the standila, and then you sit there, and there's your patron there, and your Brahmin here, or if you're the patron, the Brahmin sitting to the south, and then you're reciting these mantras, right? And some of the mantras are recited very loud, right? Uchai, right? And if they're recited very loud, if you've ever been to an Indian village and you have this thing, in Hindi you say Bharta Tamasha, a big deal, a big event, right? If you have a big event in an Indian village, everybody and his dog is going to be there watching like what's going on, And I've seen exactly that. You see these Vedic ceremonies happening in Indian villages. Everybody can hear them. Everybody knows what's going on. And then the Brahmins will say, well, those Shudras don't have mantras. They don't know what the Shudras have. They never listened to them, right? So that was part of the problem of 19th century British anthropology. They never would talk to the outcasts or the Shudras or the women, for heaven's sake. And so, the Buddhists are talking to the Shudras, the Buddhists are talking to the outcasts, and they understand, no, they actually have mantras, right? But they don't want to appear to be part of this non-mantra people, right? Which the Brahmins have already developed this idea. When you have this ideology of high status behavior, then it's very common for those who have low status to try and emulate the high status behavior, the Sanskritization, right? And undoubtedly that was happening everywhere in India at this time, during the Gupta period, most in particular, when Sanskrit was coming into its own, right? Yes? Well, you guys duke it out.
With regard to the list of poisons in the Gandhari manuscript, I think at the end of Strout's paper, he mentions that we could look to medical literature to get a better feel for what exactly these different poisons are. But I'm wondering if you think that this reflects some sort of specialized knowledge or Brahminical education, or whether all these different things would have been well known by anyone.
Well, I think the many of the poisons would have been known by a large number of people, you know, because they are, as far as I can say, overwhelmingly they are not venomous poisons. They are that of plant-based poisons. And so a lot of them would have been relatively well known. The problem we have is that, you know, we have this one mantra, the Manasvi, right? And we've got these lists of poisons, and there's a reasonable correspondence, but much of the Manasvi mantra isn't listed in these later lists of poisons. And the later lists that we have, or latest stuff we have, doesn't include a lot of what's in the Manasvi mantra. So there's not a one-to-one correlation. You know, Ingo has gone and he's found these, and he did a great job. You know, he's found these and he's found those, and that's like a correlation, and I get it. That's great. But we've got all of these other mantras that are out there that have these kinds of incomprehensible phonemes. Where are they from? What's going on? Where's these ili mili chuli triti? Ha 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 he 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 he.
So do you think that some of these poison names might be, I would hesitate to say made up, but you know, plays on other names in the same way that we have these seemingly nonsensical words?
I think the missing ingredient, and one that's generally not considered, is spirit possession. I think the missing ingredient is spirit possession. We know that Buddhist monks were being possessed by spirits. It's in the Vinaya. We know that their spirit possession was operating as a trope for various kinds of things. It's in the Ashtasasrika, that if you really are able to be a good bodhisattva, you won't be overcome by spirits. So there are all kinds of things in which spirit possession plays as this leitmotif in and out of Buddhist literature. And I think that when you're talking about India, spirit possession is one of the fundamental issues. And it's pretty clear that it's something considered to be a threat, otherwise you wouldn't have all of these raksha literature about warding off spirits who are going to possess you. And that's what, you know, the term avatarati meant in that literature. They would descend into you, they would possess you. And so you're trying to ward off avatara, right? You're trying to keep from being turned into this, right, boogeyman by this zombie taking over your body. And I think that when you're talking about India and you're talking about spirit possession, then you look at some of the literature on that, and some of the literature is that the vocalization coming out of the mouth of those who are spirit possessed is supposed to have some sort of phonemic value, much as when we look at glossolalia. In our studies of glossolalia, you can see that the phonemic value is basically predicated on the mother tongue of the person using that. So when you have Russians speaking glossolalia, it's going to be Russian in base, right? A lot of the functions that seem to be employed in glossolalia, I seem to find happening in some of the Buddhist mantras that we see. Not all by any stretch of the imagination. But I would be very surprised if they didn't operate as a phonemic base for some of what's going on, right? Indeed, Ingo Strauch's work gave me some pause in thinking maybe this might be something else that's happening. I don't know. But I'm going to sort of stick out my neck and think that spirit possession has got something going on in terms of our Buddhist phonemic utterances that are not lexical, non-semantic.
Do you think that's why you get RL retroflex?
Yeah,
so
because
often? Because it's something.
Yeah, I think you have a Dravidian basis for a lot of this. I think it's done by the Dravidian languages of the tribal peoples like Kui and Kua in central India and Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh and in Orissa. All of these areas are Dravidian language speaking areas. I think that's a lot of what's going on. Some of it, some of it is identified. The Mahamayuri identifies it. Well, these are Dravidian phrases. The Vajrapadas or Mantrapadas there are Dravidian, right? Dramitapada, right? That's what they say. And I see no reason to call that into question. So they were aware of it. Maybe some were imported from the south. I don't know. But spirit possession is ubiquitous. Now, whether the Buddhists were being possessed by spirit or they're just picking up these vocables, right, as powerful phrases, and they're going to embed them in their mantras, it's open to question. But my guess is that both. Right. Again, yes.
So like almost like a sort of protective mimicry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're, you know, what does swaha mean? You know, swaha in Vedic use is what you say when you're addressing the gods, and swada is what you use when you're addressing the Pithara, the ancestors, right? So the Buddhists say, well, we don't want to deal with the dead people. We're going to deal with the gods. So swaha is at the end of every Buddhist mantra, whereas swada is actually used in a fair number of Vedic ceremonies, particularly Shraddha ceremonies. And despite the fact that the Buddhists invested themselves heavily in post-mortem practices, they're not using swada. And that's very interesting to me that they are going to avoid that particular vocable. Attempts to try and make swaha as equivalent to hail, and that's what Ingo tries to do. It's not happening. This is a very specific pragmatic marker concerning that this thing that you've just said goes to the gods and nowhere else. That's what it says.
So can I press you on one sort of definitional issue? Because I'm
Sure.
struggling with that.
All right.
And that's namah followed by Ratnatrayaya or
Mhm.
Amitabhaya, or
Mhm.
whether that counts as a mantra or not.
Yeah.
Because you seem to include that in the category, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm
Now-
resisting that a bit, and I'd like to be persuaded that because
It,
that means that quote unquote Pure Land Buddhism is basically based on a mantra.
well, I don't have any problem with that, but I would agree to that definition. But here's the deal. Some of the texts I've looked at say that that section is not the mantra, that it's only after the tadyata. Other texts are going to include it as the mantra very straightforwardly, right? So Mahashitavati, for example, is going to use that. You know, this is part of the mantra. That's all there is to it, right? In the Mahamayuri, this is part of the mantra. You know, the Namo, something other, that's part of the mantra. And other texts I've seen, the mantra starts after that, right? So you pay homage, and then the mantra begins, right? So yes, we end up with our number of our. Is it A or B? Definitely. You know, Indians just love to break the rules when it comes to vocalization. That's one of the, you know, I mean, this idea that somehow or other you play with language. It was, you know, who was it? Name escapes me. This Indologist who wrote this famous book on play as in religious sentiment, Homo Ludens, right? His name will come back to me in about a couple of minutes here. But in any event, the idea is that he initially studied Vedic traditions, and he began to understand that it was that the play of language is something that's really, really, really important to Indians. And I've seen it so often in Indian villages. These guys will just sit around and chat with each other, and they'll riff off of each other's statements, right? And that kind of play that in which you're just invested in sounds, and it's, you know, it's onomatopoeia and it's various other kinds of this rich sonic environment of India. I think that's what's bleeding on into mantras. It can't be ignored in India. It's very different kind of environment that you have elsewhere. But the Indians just love that play. They love those sounds.
I agree. You can see that, for example, in names of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We need these long lists, right?
Yes.
And samadhi names, and they're just going for it, right?
Yeah, it's just like, you know, bam, 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 yeah, and that one too, yeah, yeah. No, it's this virtuosity of sort of, you know, it's like scatting in jazz, you know. It's just like this virtuosity of sounds, you know. And if you're invested in sounds and you're just like listening to these sounds so intently, I mean, that's the reason why they invented linguistics, because they were so invested in those sounds, you know, those points of articulation. Without that, they never would have come up with those points of articulation. Panini never would have happened. And we still believe the myth of Tower of Babel. Yes.
So what you were just mentioning with scatting and jazz is related to something that I thought when you were referring to the extreme repetition and 34 syllables within one mantra.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of a prescribed musical accompaniment, even like a percussive accompaniment that would have gone along with these books.
In the Samaveda there is, but not in Buddhism. I know of no prescribed musical accompaniment in Buddhism. And that's one of the reasons why I want to draw some bright lines between Samaveda use and the Buddhist use, right? The Samaveda use, the name Samaveda means just the Veda of song, because Sama is cognate with our English language use term song. So just think song Veda, right? And that's basically what's going on. And so they're picking up songs from the Aranya, that is the forest, and they're picking up songs from the Grama, the village, and this very rich sort of musical environment of India is where they're picking up all of this stuff, right?
And the Buddhists would have divorced any of that, the song.
Yeah, because, you know, if you're a monk, you're not supposed to hang out with, you know, song and dance, you know. That's kind of not really cool, right? And when you listen to Buddhist chanting, I mean, you know, in Tibet, Buddhist chanting is like really interesting, particularly indigenous Tibetan forms like Chu, for example. Some of the most beautiful, what they call in Tibetan yang, musical tunes, musical notes, are associated with this sort of Central Asian shamanism form of Chu. But when you get to sort of more prosaic Southeast Asian Buddhist chants, it's all da 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 da. It's just, really? That's all you can do with it? It's just not so interesting, guys. You know? I mean, East Asia, you guys did much better. You know? I listened to Japanese monks in Kyoto chanting. This is fabulous, right? How come the Indians couldn't do this, right? Yeah.
I wanted to hear more about the material you found connecting mantras and amulets, because I'm totally convinced by this argument about the sort of economic power of mantras and the kind of work, you know, the resistance, the right livelihood resistance to having monks sort of giving out these kinds of value mantras. But of course, people also wanted amulets, and you have that one quote, which, you know, where the amulets have the mantras in them.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you other material you found connecting those two.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
If we have, you know, amulets from the Gupta period that kind of.
No, we don't have any amulets from the Gupta period, but this is. I'm almost there. Yeah. This is as close as we can get.
Okay.
Right. So what this is a printing in negative. This is of stone, right? It's carved out in a negative, and you print with that into a terracotta, and then you bake it, right, in an oven. And the thing about terracotta, and this is really interesting, the thing about terracotta is that once you print it, and all over India, there are little brick kilns, because most building in India happens with brick, right? So everywhere you go, you're going to find these brick kilns, because everybody needs to have one, right? So what you do is that, you know, and there's a very old technology in India. You have the very old terracotta figurines of yakshis and yakshas and goddesses and all the kinds of stuff. And they've been making this for a very long time. So the Buddhists got on with this printing like this, and they started making this stuff. Now, Xuanzang talks about this in terms of printing on water. He said they're printing images on water, and they're printing various other kinds of stuff, right? So did the Buddhists invent printing in India? I'm not going to go there, but, you know, because they didn't invent paper, right? They didn't really have paper. It was mulberry paper that the Chinese made really printing possible, right? But it's pretty clear that they were printing off these terracotta plaques. And those little, these are relatively small, these little plaques really represented amulets, right? And this is all part of what I lovingly call pilgrimage crap, because what you do when you go on pilgrimage, you're going somewhere, you want to take something back. You know, you have an exchange mechanism in a pilgrimage. So when you go to Bodh Gaya, for example, you go there, you want to get something from Bodh Gaya, so you're going to take it home. Say, look, I went to Bodh Gaya, right? And this is the kind of thing in which you do, right? So when we find terracotta printings, or we find, you know, in Hada, for example, there were over 3,000 little images of the Buddha in Hada. It's all about pilgrimage. You know, you're just selling these things to the pilgrims, right? Look, you were in Hada. You got a Hada pilgrimage Buddha, right? And so this is what's going on. And these protective dhananis obviously operated in that way. How far did these go back? I don't see any evidence in the Gupta. I don't see any evidence in the Gupta. But it's pretty clear that from the 7th century on, they were working that way, right? And once the genie was let out of the bottle, then they went everywhere. They just went everywhere, right? Because what a great idea, right? I don't need to say the thing. I just got it right here. Got it in my little pocket, right? And it protects me, keeps me from the spirit, so I don't have to say this stuff because I don't want to go into spirit possession because it's really nasty.
So, speaking of, well, late Gupta possibly, 6th, 7th century, we have amulets. You know, little text rolled up and inside small containers. So there are a few of those. Right? I mean, the survival rate is obviously not good.
Well, that's in Central Asia, right?
Yes, in
Yeah.
Bamiyan.
Right.
Yeah,
but those are going to be
so
handwritten. There's not going to be printed,
It's
right?
handwritten. On birch bark.
Yeah, on birch barks, right. Yeah.
So
Well, those-
it's a similar kind of.
Yeah, but I don't see any before that. I don't see any actual Gupta period. I mean, the Gupta is ostensibly ends around 550, so maybe we can push it back to that, but that would kind of be a stretch. Yeah.
So I was wondering if we could find, like, in Buddhist philosophical literature or Hindu philosophical literature, like attempts at theorizing about the such elements in mantras that do not have semantic content, or like any sort of observation about this phenomenon.
Well, there are going to be, you know, almost every commentary that's going to sort of like have a mantra in it will take the mantra apart and talk about what this syllable means and what that syllable means. But it's largely free association. I mean, there are some that look veridical, but the vast majority look like they're just sort of like, oh, this word. And actually, some of our earliest, the Arapachana alphabet that's articulated in the Panchavamsha Sahasrika, that's our first sort of list about this means that and this means the other. And it's very much along the lines of A is for apple, B is for boy, something of that nature. It really is to try and infuse this letter with semantic value, right? But whereas the Arapachana alphabet is the Dharani, that alphabet is the what you recite. You don't recite the apple and the boy and the cow sort of thing.
So they never recognize the meaninglessness of those.
No, they're never going to say. The Vedic tradition said these may be considered anartika, and that's where Fritz Stahl came up with this idea that they're meaningless. There's one section in the Bodhisattva Bhumi that talks about mantra dharanis, and I translated that section, and it's fairly technical, but what it means is that it is significant, but it doesn't have denotation. It has connotation and not denotation, right? And that's how I understand that. And there's some disagreement about that, but I think that is fundamentally what's going on. So it's not that it's the problem is the term artha in Sanskrit may mean meaning or it may mean referent, right? And so in Sanskrit philosophical literature, they always had this problem about sense and reference that you know Frege had to sort of deconstruct in Western philosophical lore before we really began to understand the logic of it. But in Sanskrit philosophical literature, those two continue to be conflated. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's really fascinating. So for example, if we're looking at, well, some of the translations of current in the tongue, so we have a sense that there are two kinds of rituals they're doing. First kind is they're using the mantras to call upon the deities so that they can descend. Then they command the deities to do certain kind of job for them, and then there is a kind of sending them away. There is a ritual to send them away. The other model would be a kind of spiritual possession or interpenetration. So you're chanting like 1,000 times, so eventually you're interpenetrate with the deity or possessed.
Right.
So it's kind of bifurcated into two models. But I'm wondering, so for the earliest mantras or those Dharanis contains mantras, what kind of ritual context was there?
Same as the other. It's just whether you identify or not. And the earliest self-identification we have is that in an identifiably Indian text. I mean, Michelle Strickman, of course, argued in this Baisajikuru text that you identify yourself as Baisajikuru, but it's not clear that Guandingjing is from India, right? And it looks like an apocryphal text, but it looked like the idea was out there in some way, shape, or form. But this Muli Mantra, in which you identify yourself very straightforwardly, either as Shakyamuni or Vajrapani, and you do it for protection. That's the intent, for self-protection, right? So the other spirits get scared away, right? And that's really where the whole process begins. And once you start to do that, then it begins to arrogate to itself, ideas of Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature, various other kinds of things, or emptiness, or various other stuff. But it's not an uncomplicated question by any stretch of the imagination, how it is that you identify yourself as the Buddha. I mean, how does this happen, right? We have this idea, you're Buddha Putra or Buddha Duhita, if you're a bhikshu or bhikshuni. But in terms of actual ritual grammar, which I think what your question is, in terms of ritual grammar, other than saying I'm now identifying myself as Vajrapani, there's really not much difference, in terms of what's going on, except the one thing that you identified, that is sending the Buddha back. And I found out where that's from. That's from the Ashvalayana Grihya Parishishta, and it's specifically a question about what you do. Why is it that you send the ancestors back at the end of Shraddha? And this is taken from the Shraddha ritual. In the Shraddha ritual, you call the ancestors, and then after you make your offerings, then you send the ancestors back. You don't do that to the gods. You send the ancestors back. And the question is, in Ashvalayana, the question is, why do you send the ancestors back? And you send the ancestors back because they're kind of unruly. You can't trust the ancestors to behave themselves once they're among human beings, so you got to ask them to go, right? And that's what the deal is, right? So it comes from the Brahminical Shraddha ritual, and I was surprised to see that explanation. And these are the kind of things that I've been, ferreting out over and over again, to try and find out where this stuff is from, because otherwise it's incomprehensible. Why do you send the Buddha away? I don't know. It just looks odd. Right? You wear an amulet, but you want to get rid of the guy? I can't understand that, yeah.
So do you see an evolution in the purpose of using the mantras in the past?
Well, there's a lot of evolution. I'm interested in the earliest phase, right? But in a later period, there's a lot of evolution of the use of mantras. But overwhelmingly, by the late 7th century, overwhelmingly, what you've already identified as the 4 tantra karma, that is pacification, efflorescence, subjugation, and killing. I mean, those are the 4 tantra karma. Those very old. Sometimes there's a 5th one that's in there, uchatana, which means to send somebody away. That also is found there. It's also in the Matsya Purana, for example. Uchatana has a long history in the Rig Vedana, but by and large, it boils down to those 4, and everything else becomes subsumed into that, into the mantra use. So those are the 4 tantra karmas. And that kind of becomes stable. When we see these systems come up, initially there's a period of instability and disagreement, right? And it takes about a century or 2 for everything to kind of winnow out and people sort of argue, because, Indians like to sit around and haggle, and I mean, they're sophists, a lot of them. And, they will take the opposite position just to have a good argument, right? And that's a virtue. Intellectually, that's a wonderful virtue, right? And so after a couple of centuries of argumentation, they finally say, they've worked out the problems, they've arrived at a conclusion, and they're done. They're going on to other issues that they find more compelling at that time. And so I think that's what happens. And so once they finally ended up with the 4 tantra karmas at the end of the 7th or the early 8th century, then they were kind of done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because it gives me the historical perspective.
Sure. Sure.
I'm more familiar with the modern Buddhism.
Sure. Well, earlier on, they were this text that I've been most involved with the last several years. This text doesn't actually have killing. it does have removing people, but they talk about 3 karmas, right? And one is control, and one's efflorescence, and then there's pacification, right? But the one under control is it's really odd person out there. It's really slipped on in and deals with an entirely different. It's taken clearly from a village goddess system because the altar is a triangle, which is a standard issue for goddess altars in India. When you have a triangle, it's this symbol of a vaginal system, and that's what is understood in India, and that's what's represented in this text. And you never find those kinds of triangles outside of those kinds of sources, right? So I'm going to assume that that's the kind of source that we have sort of percolating into the text from the ground up, right? But they kind of dance around a little, and it's in this one part of the text that's clearly derived from the Atharva Veda, which is the section of the Veda tradition that's the least respectable. Atharva Veda Brahmins were considered to be really those guys that you really don't want to invite to a big gathering, right? Because they deal with all kinds of nasty stuff, and who knows what they're going to say when they get here.
I can see this is endlessly fascinating and important.
Thank you.
But we must take a break.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Ron.
Certainly. Thank you for attending.